Inflation is at its highest level in 40 years. Drug overdose deaths and illegal border crossings are at record levels. The murder rate is the highest since the 1990s. Russian troops are massing on Ukraine's border, and the President of the United States just green-lighted Vladimir Putin to invade. And China is continuing its aggression. So what have the Democratic floor leader and Senate Democrats spent the last 2 months doing? Trying to overturn 200 years of Senate rules and customs so that they can do things like ban voter ID nationwide and use your tax dollars to support political campaigns. They tell us that Americans are living under Jim Crow 2.0, and they cite the recent Georgia election law as proof. Let's investigate this so-called vote suppression law. Under the new law, the state of Georgia will have 17 days of early voting. If this is Jim Crow 2.0, then I have bad news, because the Democratic leader's home state of New York and the president's home state of Delaware were engaged in, I guess, what you'd call Jim Crow 3.0 as recently as last year, because New York only had 9 days of early voting, and Delaware had no days, 0 days of early voting. Next, I've heard complaints that Georgia has reduced the number of ballot drop boxes in the state, even though they now require every county to have a drop box, as was not the case as recently as 2018, and that Georgia's added new security measures to prevent fraud. Once again, I hate to break the news that the Democratic floor leader's home state of New York had 0 ballot drop boxes, and the president's home state of Delaware allowed for just 5 last year. And of course, one of the Democrats' favorite claims is that all those terrible Republicans down in Georgia have stopped campaign and political workers from giving food and drinks to people waiting in line at the polls. Where could Georgia have gotten such an idea? Well, as it turns out, the Democratic floor leader's home state of New York also has a nearly identical law banning such electioneering near polling places. The Democrats also say that voter ID is a kind of new Jim Crow. That might surprise the 69% of black Americans who support voter ID. Now, what are they up to? This is a especially good question given the letter that 28 Democrats still in the Senate signed on April 7th, 2017. To the leadership around here, urging to oppose any effort to stop the Senate's tradition and custom of extended debate. Some of those senators are on the floor with us at this moment. I see the junior senator from Illinois, and the junior senator from Hawaii, and the junior senator from Maine, the presiding officer, for that matter. Many more were down here earlier. And Mr. President, I would invite, through the chair, any of those senators, if they would like to engage in a colloquy, to explain why they have changed their position since they signed that letter on April 7th, 2017. I guess I don't have any takers. I will point out that of the 28 Democrats who signed that letter,
will Senator yield?
I will certainly yield.
Thank you. Excuse me.
Senator from Maine.
I'm one that signed that letter. First, let's talk about the letter itself. What it says is, we're united in our determination to preserve the ability of members to engage in extended debate when bills are on the Senate floor. I agree with that. The proposal that's going to be put on the floor today is one that will allow extended debate. There are 2 points that have caused me to modify the position that I took on this letter. One is the nature of the issue that's before the body. If we were here talking about immigration or gun control or any of the other many issues that we consider, I wouldn't be taking the position that I am. I believe that the rules of the Senate are important and that extended debate is an important part of the Senate process. However, we're talking about fundamental structural changes, not policy changes, but structural changes, that I believe, in spite of your comments, that in many states across the country are compromising the ability of our people to express themselves in our democracy. I consider that qualitatively different than a policy difference. And that's why I am here today to talk about revising the rules, not blowing up the filibuster, but to get back to what the filibuster actually means. And that is extended debate. I'm all for extended debate until we're exhausted, until we've made a deal, until we've come to a compromise. But the problem is the filibuster as we define it today is a distant cousin of the real filibuster. The radical change in the filibuster isn't what's being discussed today. It was made in 1975 almost by accident. In 1975, they were debating whether it should be 2/3 of senators present and voting or a lower number, and they compromised on 60 senators of sworn members.
Mr. President, I would invite, through the chair, any of those senators, if they would like to engage in a colloquy, to explain why they changed their position since they signed that letter on April 7th, 2017. I guess I don't have any takers. I will point out that of the 28 Democrats who signed that letter,
Will Senator yield?
I will certainly yield.
Thank you. Excuse me.
Senator from Maine.
I'm one that signed that letter. First, let's talk about the letter itself. What it says is, we're united in our determination to preserve the ability of members to engage in extended debate when bills are on the Senate floor. I agree with that. The proposal that's going to be put on the floor today is one that will allow extended debate. There are 2 points that have caused me to modify the position that I took on this letter. One is the nature of the issue that's before the body. If we were here talking about immigration or gun control or any of the other many issues that we consider, I wouldn't be taking the position that I am. I believe that the rules of the Senate are important and that extended debate is an important part of the Senate process. However, we're talking about fundamental structural changes, not policy changes, but structural changes, that I believe, in spite of your comments, that in many states across the country are compromising the ability of our people to express themselves in our democracy. I consider that qualitatively different than a policy difference. And that's why I am here today to talk about revising the rules, not blowing up the filibuster, but to get back to what the filibuster actually means. And that is extended debate. I'm all for extended debate until we're exhausted, until we've made a deal, until we've come to a compromise. But the problem is the filibuster as we define it today is a distant cousin of the real filibuster. The radical change in the filibuster isn't what's being discussed today. It was made in 1975 almost by accident. In 1975, they were debating whether it should be 2/3 of senators present and voting or a lower number, and they compromised on 60 senators of sworn members. That was the focus of that discussion, and I've talked to parliamentarians who were involved in that discussion. I asked the specific question, did they really realize what they were doing by creating the mail-in, dial-in, no-effort filibuster? And the answer was no. They didn't discuss it, they didn't think of it. So what I'm talking about here today and what the proposal that will be on the floor later is to do exactly what this letter says, extended debate. Extended debate. And that's why I believe that what we're proposing today is in the deepest tradition of the United States Senate. What we are trying to scale back is the cheap, easy, dial in from your office, 60 votes, de facto supermajority requirement, which is not in the Constitution, which the framers expressly did not agree to. They put in a lot of checks and balances. 2 houses of Congress, 2/3 voting on treaties, 2/3 voting on an amendment, confirmation of the president, the Congress, the independence of the courts. All those were checks and balances. One of them was not a supermajority requirement in the United States Senate. Hamilton and Madison expressly said that that would turn democracy on its head. Democracy ultimately is about majority rule. And there should be minority rights. The minority should have every opportunity to speak, to offer amendments, to discuss, to offer germane amendments, I might add, and discuss and debate, but ultimately not have a veto. That's really what it comes down to here. Do you have a rule that says that the minority actually is in control of the legislative process? That's not what the framers intended. It's antithetical to what the framers intended. In fact, one of the reasons for the Constitutional Convention was the dysfunction of the Articles of Confederation, and one of the reasons cited for that dysfunction was a supermajority requirement. So, yes, I voted, what I supported 3 years ago, I still support. The language is full, robust, and extended debate. And that's what's going to be proposed later on. And I would, if you guys will vote for it, this debate can go on as it should for weeks and perhaps months, because it's that important. But I don't have any apologies to make. If I have to choose between a Senate rule as it works now, which, as I say, is a distant cousin of the real filibuster, and democracy itself, I'm going to take democracy every single time.
Well, I thank the Senator from Maine for explaining the change in position. I was not seeking an apology, merely an explanation, since I haven't heard that much over the last year or so. I can respond to a few of these points. So the Senator from Maine said it was the nature of the issue at stake. Well, first off, I'd point out I have the letter in front of me here. It's very short. It's only 2 paragraphs long. There's nothing in there about the nature of the issue at stake, about whether we're talking about immigration or gun control or, in this case, election takeover laws. The Senator from Maine referred to the cheap and easy filibuster. I don't necessarily agree with that characterization, but I would point out that that's exactly the kind of cheap and easy filibuster that was in place in 2017 when 28 Democrats signed this letter. I also point out that I wouldn't necessarily agree with the characterization that the current filibuster was created by accident in 1975. We can have a debate, but the rules and customs under debate today go back to the second decade of the United States Senate. And perhaps more importantly, every time those rules have been modified, up to and including the most recent changes on the legislative calendar, they've been modified in accordance with the rules, not using the nuclear option, breaking the rules so we can change the rules. Mr. President, I also know we've had a few other signatories to that letter arrive. We have the senior senator from Colorado. We have the senior senator from New Hampshire. We have the senior senator from Montana. And we have the letter's chief Democratic author, the junior senator from Delaware. I asked earlier through the chair if any senators would like to explain their change in position. Since those senators have joined us, if they would like to explain their change as well, I would invite them into a colloquy.
Would the senator yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. Because I'm struck by your comment that in all previous situations, that the rules have been modified by a change of the rules that is done through the regular rule process. Because I'd encourage you to read up on your Senate history, it's just not the case. In fact, under Senator Byrd's leadership, 9 times this chamber changed the interpretation of existing rules, and they didn't do it through a formal rules change process. They did it with an interpretation of the chair being sustained or by reversing the interpretation of the chair. And you've been here when a nuclear option modified the rules. Your party led the effort to change the requirement for closing debate on the Supreme Court. And you've been here, or I think you were here, your colleagues were here, when they changed the rule, not by changing the rules formally, but by reinterpreting it through a nuclear option in regards to decreasing the number of hours for debate on district judges. It also goes back to the fact that your team changed the rules without going through the formal rule process on how reconciliation is done in order to be able to do tax cuts for the rich. And then Kent Conrad, on our side, advocated change it back, and your side, in preparation for the Trump tax cuts of 2017, changed the rule again. So at least let us understand that both sides, Democrats and Republicans, have resorted to reinterpreting the rules on various occasions. Just a point of clarification that your statement was wrong.
I appreciate the comments of the senator from Oregon, and I want to commend him for principled consistency on this question. He did not sign that letter. In fact, one of the earliest conversations I had with any Democratic senator in 2015 was with the senator from Oregon about some of these very questions. He has had these reservations about the cloture rule, about the rights and customs of extended debate. He has not changed his view on those positions, so I commend him. I will point out, he mentions the nuclear option on the Supreme Court. Of course, that simply followed what the former Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid did in 2013 on the executive calendar. I will also point out that that happened in February or March of 2017, if I recall. This is 2017. This letter was written in April of 2017. But if there's no more extended debate on this question, I would invite the senator from Virginia through the chair.
President, if I might respond. Senator Cotton, what Angus said, and I'm so glad that Senator Langford has stayed in the room, because you've been saying we've changed our position. You just really need to read the letter, and I do appreciate that you put it up, because others were referring to the letter without doing that, and the operative phrase is exactly what you read. We are united in our determination to preserve the ability of members to engage in extended debate when bills are on the Senate floor. We couldn't even debate this bill. You guys wouldn't let us. You kept using the 60-vote block on the motion to proceed so that we couldn't get on the bill. In the 5 years since 2017, many of us have come to realize this is what we want, but the current abuse of Senate rules is blocking us from having discussions about voting rights or about matters that you think are important. This is still what we want. We want the ability to have extended debate when bills are on the Senate floor. And that is what the motion will eventually be about when we vote on it later today. To move to a talking filibuster instead of a secret filibuster. The way to look at the rule change that we're going to contemplate later is, if you really love the filibuster, and the word filibuster isn't in this letter at all, but if you really love the filibuster, do you demand that it stay secret, or should it be carried out open, publicly, in view of the voters and your Senate colleagues? That's what the vote will be. We have listened to those of you who have said, don't abolish the filibuster, don't nuke the filibuster, don't blow up the filibuster, don't weaken the filibuster, and the only change we propose is that the filibuster be a public filibuster, not a secret one. And so you stood on the floor and asked if we would join you in that operative phrase, engage in extended debate when bills are on the Senate floor. The combination of the block on the motion to proceed together with the paper pocket filibuster, where people do not have to show up to speak, much less to vote. We can restore the filibuster, frankly, to what it was during the vast majority of the Senate's history, and require that people actually do it and be accountable to their colleagues and to the public, and that's what we propose to do.
Mr. President, Mr. President, I invite the senator from Colorado to engage in colloquy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that from the senator from Arkansas. I, just along the lines of what my colleagues have said, would also say that I want to be very clear that I don't want this place to turn into the House of Representatives. I think that would be a huge mistake, but it is not behaving the way that the founders designed it to behave, and the history, admittedly is opaque, but it is very clear to me that the modern abuse of the filibuster represents very little in the way of traditional Senate practice or what the framers were considering. So I can imagine finding ourselves to a place where we actually have extended debate, where we actually have a public filibuster like we used to have. Everybody remembers the movie version of that, but they actually did that on the floor of the Senate versus the secret filibuster that acts as a perpetual veto by the minority on the majority, something that the framers clearly were trying to avoid, and at the same time gives the minority the chance to hold the floor, persuade the American people of their point of view, amend legislation in ways that is unimaginable in the House, and then in the end gives the majority the chance to actually make a decision so we can effectively compete with countries all over the world that aren't held up by the kind of veto we're talking about. There's not a legislative body in the world that I'm aware of, except in any of the other countries with which we compete, that has a filibuster. So I'd say that other piece of this, the idea that we're going to seesaw back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, I think the reality is that's not what happens in other places that don't have a filibuster. And I believe we have the opportunity, if we're actually having a public debate, not sitting in our office or, off fundraising, but instead having a public debate on the floor of this Senate, that the American people can actually begin to hold people here accountable again for their position on health care or guns or whatever it is. We don't ever get the chance to do that here because we never even have a debate in the world's most deliberative body. So if we've got a disagreement tonight about the form of all of this, my hope is that in the wake of this, if we're not successful, we actually do the American people a favor by creating a set of rules that actually will make this place work. I have been here now for 12 years. It's hard to believe. And I can tell you the Senate doesn't work. It can't get its basic business done, much less make hard decisions. And I think we can do better than that. And I hope we will.
Mr. President, the senator from Oklahoma was directly addressed, and I believe you'd like to engage in a brief
Senator from Oklahoma.
President, thank you. To my friend, through the chair, to the senator from Virginia, thanks for the engagement. We'll continue to be able to engage, be able to talk through this. Part of our challenge on dealing with this dialogue today is none of our side has actually seen the proposal tonight. It's a secret proposal that's coming out that all the conversation is this restores the talking filibuster. We're like, really? What does it say? And then in the next, I guess, couple of hours, there's going to be a proposal pop and say, here it is. We're changing the rules of the Senate with a 51 vote when we haven't even had the opportunity to see it. So we talk about trying to be able to bring dialogue and debate on all these things. That's not dialogue and debate on the rules. That's trying to ram through a change with a straight 51 that none of us have even seen. And as we go through this on the, you had mentioned before on the letter that's out there, you're correct, I read through the letter, not definitely read through the whole letter, but I could have also brought a bunch of quotes from folks that I see around the room that made statements like, I will never change the legislative filibuster, or I am 100% opposed to changing the legislative filibuster, or we should not change the filibuster using the nuclear option. So there were lots of other quotes from lots of other interviews, because obviously around 2017, when the letter came out, there was lots of media that asked point blank, what do you mean by that? And so there's a lot of clarification with it. So you're right, I read the letter and it has the vague language, but I could have read lots of quotes that we have that were very, very specific on it. The end of the day is, if we're going to solve the issues in the Senate, we're going to have to actually work together to be able to solve the issues. What makes us the greatest deliberative body is not that 51 can do what they want. What will make it the greatest deliberative body is when we have to actually talk to each other. When I was elected in 2014, most of the phone calls that came to me personally between November and January were some of you that called me and said, my name is, we're going to disagree on a lot of things, but let's start working now on what we'll agree on. If we start doing away with these rules on a 50 and just move it to a 51 basis, those conversations end. And it's not a deliberative body. Suddenly it's a we can get what we want with 51 body. That's the House. That's why we bring it up. I yield.
Mr. President, before I move on from this letter, I just have to note that, as I've said several times, 28 Democrats in the Senate today signed that letter. 27 of them changed their position. There's one signatory who didn't change his position, a senator from West Virginia. Not only did he not change his position from that letter he signed, he's been consistent from the very beginning. He was also here in 2013 when we started down this path on the executive calendar. And there are differences, to be sure, between the executive calendar and the legislative calendar. But the senator from West Virginia is the sole signatory still in the Senate who's been consistent throughout. And I want to commend him for that. And I want to note for the record, the senator from Arizona, apparently the only other Democratic senator who will oppose this maneuver, did not sign the letter in 2017 because she was not in the Senate in 2017. So, Mr. President, in conclusion, why are we doing all this? Why are we going down this road? Is it because this legislation is so popular, this issue is so important? You'd think it was the top issue on the minds of a majority of Americans. But no, according to Gallup, only 1% of Americans list elections and federal election takeovers as their top priority. Maybe the majority of Americans support the procedural maneuvering here tonight, the overturning of 200 years of Senate rules and customs. Nope, wrong again. According to a recent CBS poll, barely a third of Americans support this. And while we're waiting here for the Democrats' doomed charge to overturn 200 years of Senate rules and customs and federalize our elections, Americans are dealing with very real, concrete, kitchen table issues. Our people are getting poorer. Inflation rose by 7% over the last year, the highest rate in 40 years. Wages are failing to keep up. Inflation might not be so bad for some of the millionaires around here with their stock portfolios and their real estate, but for most Americans it's crippling. And it's most crippling for those who can least afford it. I shouldn't have to point out, but people are dying in our communities all across the country. Murder was up by its highest record level in the keeping modern records last year, and it's up again this year. At a time where we also have 100,000 Americans dying of overdoses, the highest number ever recorded, another grim record. Meanwhile, America is being overwhelmed at our southern border. Border Patrol is stopping more than 175,000 illegal immigrants at our southern border each month. We can only guess how many more are getting through. These are all real problems that the American people have told us repeatedly they want us to address. But we haven't heard much about those problems. We're not here in session this week to debate those problems. The Democrats apparently don't want to acknowledge these crises because they created these crises and they have no solution for these crises. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Your new hires trained on your tech stack. What haven't you? Start here to get there.
Mr. President, I want to talk today about Russia. I want to talk about Vladimir Putin. I want to describe to this chamber a bipartisan victory that together we won. And then I want to describe tragically how President Joe Biden is giving that victory away to Putin and Russia. To understand this issue, we need to go back to the summer of 2019. In the summer of 2019, Russia was in the process of constructing a pipeline called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Behind me is a map demonstrating where the Nord Stream 2 pipeline runs. It is a pipeline that was to run from Russia to Germany, going underneath the Baltic Sea. The summer of 2019, the pipeline was nearly complete. At various periods in time, it was 70% complete, 80% complete. There was widespread consensus that if this pipeline were completed, it would have devastating consequences. In a few minutes, I will discuss those consequences in greater detail. But in an effort to stop the devastating consequences, I worked on bipartisan legislation along with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, and we introduced bipartisan sanctions legislation designed to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That legislation, when we introduced it, was almost immediately subject to a Russian disinformation campaign. In Europe, the Russians were saying to anyone who would listen that the Cruz-Shaheen sanction legislation could never pass, that there was no way Congress would come together in a bipartisan manner to stop the Nord Stream 2, that it was hopeless, that no one needed to be concerned that this legislation could pass. They also made the argument as part of their disinformation campaign that the pipeline was nearly complete, so that U.S. sanctions could not stop it. There was nothing that could be done to stop it. Well, Mr. President, to the surprise of nobody who follows these issues, that Russian disinformation was precisely that. It was disinformation. It was lies. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Shaheen and I worked with our colleagues, and our legislation was initially voted out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 20 to 2. Overwhelming bipartisan support. At that point, Senator Shaheen and I began working to get it passed on the floor of the Senate. While we were doing so, the Russian disinformation continued. This cannot pass. We endeavored to have our sanctions legislation attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was moving in the fall and winter of 2019. To do so, Mr. President, was not easy. To do so, we needed to get the explicit sign-off of the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We needed the explicit sign-off of the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We needed the explicit sign-off of the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. And then we needed the explicit sign-off of Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer, the Republican and Democratic leader, respectively. All 8 of those individuals, all 8 of those senators needed to agree with our legislation for this to proceed on the NDAA. And then, Mr. President, we had to do the exact same thing in the House of Representatives and get the chairman and ranking member on foreign relations, on armed services, on banking, and we had to get the sign-off of Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. To get the explicit support of all 16 of those congressional leaders, 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats, in any world is not easy. And I will say, on my part and Senator Shaheen's part, we invested dozens, if not hundreds of hours in terms of talking to our colleagues to build that bipartisan consensus. And we ended up getting that overwhelming support. In many ways, that support was miraculous. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why Nord Stream 2 is particularly problematic is that Russia is building Nord Stream 2 in order to cut off Ukraine. There is currently a pipeline running through Ukraine And through Nord Stream 2, Russia has the power to starve Ukraine. Why is it miraculous in December of 2019 that we're able to pass this legislation? Well, if you recall what was happening in the House of Representatives in December of 2019, the House of Representatives was in the middle of impeaching President Donald Trump for alleged high crimes and misdemeanors concerning Ukraine. If you recall, Mr. President, from the trial we held on the Senate floor, central to the allegations that were raised by Democrats against President Trump was conduct concerning Ukraine. It remains astonishing that right in the middle of a partisan gladiatorial battle concerning Ukraine, simultaneously we were able to get Republicans and Democrats to work hand in hand to agree with complete consensus that we were going to come together and stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We were going to stop what Vladimir Putin was doing. In December of 2019, our legislation passed. The Cruz Shaheen sanctions legislation passed. Now, Mr. President, I will remind you of what the Russian disinformation had been when we first introduced it. They said it'll never pass. And they said even if it does pass, it's too late for it to have any effect. Well, if my memory serves me correctly, President Trump signed the Cruz Shaheen sanctions legislation at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. At 6:45 p.m. on a Thursday, 15 minutes before our sanctions legislation was signed into law, the company that was laying the pipeline in the Baltic Sea announced it had immediately halted laying the pipeline. And it was lifting anchor and sailing away. It was an incredible bipartisan victory. The pipeline was stopped in its tracks. What happened next was absolutely nothing. For a year, the pipeline lay dormant. The talking point from Vladimir Putin, and now sadly adopted by Joe Biden and his administration, is the pipeline is 90% complete, or the pipeline is 95% complete. But Mr. President, it is not rocket science that a 90% complete pipeline is 0% complete. Until you complete both ends of the pipeline, it ain't nothing but a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean. Nothing is traveling through it until the pipeline is complete and online. For a year, the pipeline lay dormant. Then in the year 2020, Senator Shaheen and I joined together again in a second round of bipartisan legislation. A second round of sanctions. We had stopped the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in its tracks. For a year, Putin was stopped altogether, and we came together for a second piece of legislation. The second version of Cruz Shaheen, and just like the first sanctions, we passed it through both houses of Congress and it was signed into law. With overwhelming bipartisan support, nearly unanimous support of all 535 members of Congress. So we now have two major pieces of sanctions legislation on the books. And those sanctions had been working for a year and the pipeline was stopped. Then in November of 2020 was the presidential election. And in the wake of the presidential election, Joe Biden and his transition team almost immediately began telegraphing weakness to Russia. Members of Joe Biden's foreign policy advisory team in the German newspapers expressed openness to Nord Stream 2 being built, expressed a willingness to try to circumvent the sanctions that had been working and had worked for over a year. Within days, of Joe Biden and his team expressing weakness to Putin, Russia and Putin heard. And they began the process of getting ready to return to building the pipeline. Russia did return to building the pipeline. You know what day, Madam President? January 24th, 2021. 4 days after Joe Biden was sworn into office, Putin said, "We're safe, we're free, our man Joe is in the White House." And we know that the administration is not going to follow U.S. law anymore. And so on January 24th, the Russians returned to building the pipeline. Now, for 2 years, this body had been united, Republicans and Democrats, that we were going to stop this pipeline. But Joe Biden and his administration decided instead to waive the sanctions. Decided instead to give Vladimir Putin what amounts to a multi-billion-dollar gift. And not just a gift one time. If this pipeline is allowed to go online, it will put billions of dollars in Putin's pockets every year, year after year after year. What are the consequences of Nord Stream 2? Number one, Russia gets richer, Russia gets stronger, Russia gets billions of dollars that it can use to build its military, to threaten its neighbors, to threaten our allies, to endanger the lives of Americans and our friends. Number two, Europe is hurt. Our friends and allies in Europe are made even more dependent on Russian energy. Madam President, our former colleague in this body, Senator John McCain, may he rest in peace. He had a phrase for Russia that was memorable, that I've used many times. He referred to Russia as a gas station with a country attached. That is Putin's plan. It is very simple. Putin is a petro-tyrant. He's a tyrant. He's a bully. He's a KGB thug, and all of his aggression is funded by selling oil and gas. Together, Republicans and Democrats in Congress had taken billions out of Putin's pockets. And sadly, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris decided the world would be a better place if instead Putin had billions more, not just this year or next year, but for decades to come. When Putin is dead and buried and the next dictator is ruling over Russia, that next dictator will be reaping the benefits of this pipeline. Indeed, as a result of Joe Biden's decision, many are referring to this pipeline as the Biden-Putin pipeline. For a very simple reason. It is Putin that is building it. It is Putin that is profiting by it. And the only reason Putin is allowed to do so is because President Joe Biden has given him a multi-billion-dollar gift. It strengthens Russia. It weakens Europe. It makes Europe subject to energy blackmail. Putin has demonstrated a willingness and indeed a history of using energy blackmail, of using those who are dependent on natural gas to coerce them to do what he wants. In the dead of winter, when people are at risk of freezing to death, Putin has threatened to and has in fact cut off gas to endanger the lives of innocent civilians in order to coerce to bending to his will. As a result of Joe Biden's surrender to Vladimir Putin, Putin will have the continued ability to exercise economic blackmail against Europe. And not only that, has energy needs. Those energy needs could be readily satisfied by American energy. Europe has expressed a willingness and in some instances an eagerness to import American energy. But Joe Biden has decided that American jobs are unimportant. His first day in office, Biden shut down the Keystone Pipeline, killing 11,000 jobs in the United States, including 8,000 union jobs, 8,000 high-paying union jobs that with a stroke of a pen, Joe Biden eliminated. And at the exact same time that Biden is shutting down jobs in a pipeline in America, he is green-lighting and giving a gift to Vladimir Putin of a pipeline between Russia and Germany, producing jobs in Russia, producing billions of dollars in Russia, and taking away jobs in America. This pipeline is a disaster. As the afternoon goes on, I will elaborate on different aspects in which it is harmful, and on the steps we can and should be taking to stop it. But at this point, Senator Barrasso is here and has some thoughts he wishes to express, and so I will yield the floor to Senator Barrasso for his remarks.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to join and add my voice to that of Senator Cruz, the senator from Texas, about Joe Biden's surrender to Vladimir Putin. You know, energy is called the master resource for a reason. Powers our country, powers our military, powers this nation, powers the economy. And yet, Joe Biden, on his first day in office, seemed to take us from a nation of energy dominance to energy dependence, canceling the Keystone XL pipeline and now approving this pipeline, Nord Stream 2. And I come to add my voice to all of those, and there are many who have spoken out against the president in expressing our deep concerns about